Hello, and welcome to this edition of Drop in Drawing. My name is Padma Rajendran, and I am a teaching artist with the Met. In my own studio work, I often work with fabric, printmaking, drawing, including collage, and painting. Today we'll be creating a collage from materials you most likely already have at home. Collage is an art technique done by adhering different papers, materials like photographs or fabric, to another surface. We typically think of patterns to be orderly in structure and in repetition. The inspiration for today will be this American quilt top dated from the late 1870s that features a crazy pattern. Crazy patterns were often sewn by hand to make the broken arrangement of fabric scraps look wild. Scraps of fabric include silk, satin, velvet, and cotton. Although these quilts look haphazard, they require a lot of planning. These quilts feature a variety of stitching styles and embroidery motifs. There are a number of ideas about how the crazy quilt got its name, but it most likely refers to the crazed or cracked appearance of the block. Crazy quilts were even so popular that by the mid-1880s, quilters could order complete quilt kits with detailed instructions on how to assemble them. The silk pieces that came with the kits were often stamped with a pattern, such as the outline of a flower, and the quilter would embroider over the design. This beautifully designed crazy quilt was not made from a quilt kit, but functioned as a mourning quilt for its maker, Tamar Horton Harris of North's Landing, Indiana. It was made as a memorial after the death of her only child, 20-year-old Grace Gertrude North, in 1877. Tamar Horton Harris North was born on January 23rd in 1833 in Indiana. In 1852, she married a well-to-do farmer, Benjamin F. North, and after serving 3 years in the Civil War, he returned home. He and Grace died within a month of each other in the winter of 1877. Assuming that Tamar North started working on the quilt soon after her daughter's death in 1877, this is a fairly early example of a crazy quilt. It is made of silks and silk velvet, but there are also pieces of cotton and cotton lace. According to family history, North made the quilt from pieces of Grace's dresses, and the types of fabrics used and the unusual additions of bits of lace seem to bear this out. Many symbols of Grace's death ornament this quilt. Her name is embroidered at the center, and in the block to the right, there is a patch inscribed with purple ink that records her birth and death dates. The same block includes a patch that is painted with an angel. Judging from surviving diaries, sewing seems to have been a great comfort to the 19th century woman in times of sorrow. Likewise, in this time period, we are spending more time at home, reflecting upon our objects around us, and looking to keep our hands busy while using what we have and acknowledging our circumstances and mindfully moving through it. Keeping hands busy often becomes a way of coping. The quilt top is composed of 9-pieced blocks arranged in a 3x3 grid, surrounded by a black plaid silk border, with corner blocks of black rippled silk fabric, often called moire, with floral embroidery in each corner. The quilt is a near perfect square measuring at 54.5 by 55 inches. If you're thinking about the size of this quilt in terms of a bed, it is about 3/4 as long as a full-sized bed. There is an abundance of textures from the variety of silk and cotton fabrics and the embroidery thread throughout this quilt. The patches and border are embroidered with both cotton thread and a kind of tufted thread called chenille. Some patches are decorated with paint as well as embroidery. It is my guess each of the quilt squares measures about 15 by 15 inches. That's just a little bigger than a square foot. The center square features a larger black diagonal rectangle with the name of her daughter Grace embroidered with 2 white calla lilies on either side of her name. Each quilt square features a prominent rectangle or another shape in the center with an embroidered floral motif. This quilt square that I will focus my collage on is in the upper right corner, and at the center is a piece of dark moire fabric larger than the surrounding scraps. This piece of silk has an embroidered floral strawberry plant with 6 small strawberries and 6 white flowers. It is surrounded by stitches that form small triangles by stacked linear stitches. Surrounding the starker piece are more scraps of dark and light colored fabrics with different floral embroidery, and a blue stitched anchor, a scrap of black lace against pink fabric, and Grace's initials, the letters G and N, at opposite ends of the square. There is an abundance of rich detail through embroidered naturalistic motifs and decorative stitching at the borders of each scrap to connect to another unique shape of fabric. Many of the fabrics within this quilt block have a sheen that indicates they are silk or satin. All of these scraps have an additional texture from the decorative stitching outlining the shape of the scrap, and many have embroidered design motifs in various thread colors resembling flowering plants. These seams that hold the scraps together feature the blanket stitch, and on many a stem stitch that looks similar to a drawn line as it traces and outlines the shape of the scrap while attaching it to the adjacent piece. This is just one of many segments in this complex and varied quilt. Now let's get started. Now we will gather our materials. You'll need a piece of backing paper that could be potentially white or even some construction paper, or if you have a piece of thin cardboard, that would work well. You'll eventually trim your piece of backing paper to a square. I'll show you how to do that. But in the meantime, you'll need to gather some scissors, glue and/or tape works, perhaps some markers, or it's okay if you just have one, some miscellaneous paper. I have some construction paper, but it's always nice to gather some found paper material as well, either photographic, some bits of magazine, maybe the interior of a security envelope, or anything else that you might find. You could also be gathering some found fabrics, as well as some string, and maybe some ribbon and decorative ribbon. So once you've gathered all of these, you're going to push them to the side, and let's focus on the backing paper. I'm going to first make my square. So first, I'll start by taking a corner of my paper and folding it down so that the edges meet. And it forms a bit of a triangle with this fold. I'm going to fold it. And now, when I open it up, I'll have a square after I make a trim here. Something that I like to do is just fold this part so that I have a clear idea where to cut, and I'll use the crease as my guide. Or you could just follow the edge. So I'll grab my scissors and cut. It absolutely doesn't have to be perfect, but just an option to start. So even though I have a fold in the center, that's okay, because I'll be adding different papers and fabrics and covering up this backing. So now I'm going to start gathering my different papers, and I encourage you to start with bigger pieces so you can trim. And I'm going to be looking at my selected quilt block that does feature more of a rectangle shape in the center. I'll start with that. And then I can immediately start gluing or putting tape down, but it's also nice to think about planning and where you might like to incorporate other pieces of paper or even different patterns as well. So I'm going to first start with this piece since I know for sure that I want it in this location. You can use glue, double-sided tape, or even just regular tape to adhere this piece down. And we're going to be starting with bigger pieces, and even if it feels a little random, they will eventually create a rhythm throughout your collage. So I'll put more pieces down. Feel free to overlap some of the similar shapes and textures. I always enjoy how they get broken in this moment of the overlap. And so now I'm going to keep adding more pieces. I wanted to experiment. I didn't have the color pink, so I created some toned pink paper with the marker that I had. So I'm going to cut out some of these shapes that I want from this toned paper. Experiment with that. I'm going to keep adding and maybe even thinking about tucking in some shape. So I'm trying to limit some of my white spaces. And thinking ahead, I'm also going to definitely use some of the floral motifs and consider incorporating floral motif within my collage for later. But perhaps in your space, you can look around and start thinking about what symbols or even patterns maybe you'd like to incorporate. Okay, I'm going to keep working on this and also planning on moving and seeing which fabrics could look nice. Something that could work in your process is holding the fabric or even any kind of paper and seeing where you might like it, what feels right to add where. So now that I've added in the bigger pieces, I'm going to try and fill in the smaller spaces. I could do that with some smaller shaped pieces of fabric, some felt, or this construction paper. One thing that you can do is experiment with, aside from plugging in smaller pieces like this, if you have some really narrow areas, you could take your marker and create little patterns within those spaces and maybe fill in those tighter spots, those tighter zones with a pattern of your own. And perhaps it could be something you've made up, perhaps it is pattern with a symbol that is important to you, but feel free to experiment. Okay, so I'm going to add in more shapes and a little bit more detail till I get to the final. Now I'm going to add a few more details that will mirror the embroidery. If you have one marker, that's great to use, but if you have a few more, feel free to use those as well. So really looking at the quilt block for some inspiration on stitches, I am going to mimic the stitches by outlining the shapes, and I feel comfortable letting them overlap into the adjacent shape. Maybe I want to double over the stitch. Maybe I want to create my own little pattern across the shapes. And that's something that you can do throughout, as if you're connecting these fabrics and pieces of paper together. This will also create a visual guide. Once you're done adding your decorative stitches with your marker, you can add in decorative motifs such as flowering plants or even symbols that feel important to you. I've identified that I would like to add flowers. I've been doing a lot of cooking during quarantine, and I'm also on the computer a lot, even though I try to get close to nature. I'm also going to include a paintbrush. So in the center, very much like Tamar Horton North, I'm going to add in a plant as a symbol and motif in this central shape. And then maybe I'll add in a little paintbrush. Here. And I really do enjoy nature, so perhaps a bit more representation of that. And a lot of Zoom and online work. So I'm going to include my computer as well as a symbol of my day-to-day. And I can also add in pot to symbolize all of the cooking that I have been doing, and a lot of chopping of vegetables as well. feel free to take some of these motifs and repeat them, create different patterns with them. So I'm going to add in some flowers and maybe even a variation on the paisley design. And feel free to be creative with looking around your home, the space you're in, and capturing some of those details. Yeah, I've also been reading a lot, and that has been nice. So feel free to add as much as you want. You could even create some additional patterns within your shapes. And feel free, if you have some decorative ribbon, I'm going to maybe place it here. Just adding a little glue. And what's nice about this glue is that it does dry clear, and most items stick to it. And I could even draw some motifs within the ribbon. And while you're making your collage, you can still keep adding, and that's something that I find really wonderful. You can keep adding pieces if it's something not going right, or maybe you've made a mark that you want to cover up because you're not so happy with it, please do so. Maybe I'll add in just a little bit here. And then for my final piece, maybe a little rickrack. Oops. So working from quilts and patterns offers endless resources for playing with shape, creating pattern with collage, and if you've enjoyed this process, you can experiment with creating even more collage quilt squares to put together. Thank you, and I hope you enjoyed this process.